Hi guys, Mrs. Karaz here. We are looking at Chapter 17, Section 4, Farming in the West. So in 1862, the American government issued the Homestead Act, which offered a 160-acre plot of land to anyone who would be willing to move west and live on the land for 5 years. This seems like a great deal, right? The government is handing out land for free. You get this giant set of land for nothing. All you have to do is live on it. Seems simple enough. What motivated the Homestead Act to be passed? Well, the government wanted to give poor Americans the opportunity to become farmers, right? We could benefit from having more agriculture in our country, and the government sees that as a good way to both provide jobs for our citizens and also provide food for our citizens. The government also wanted to help settle the American territories in the West. Remember, there's a certain population number that you need to hit before you could apply for statehood, and we want to make that happen. We want to see our union become stronger. Here's the problems that came from the Homestead Act, and we'll look at this more closely in class. So the land itself was free, but that's not, when you're moving, right, it's not just the house or the apartment or the land that you need to buy. Few people had the money they actually needed to gather all their stuff, move it out west, and then buy what they needed to start a farm on that land. The land itself wasn't enough. It was still expensive to set up and begin working the land. Another problem was that land companies took over large areas of land illegally. The government would grant a plot to a family, and that family would sell it to these land companies, giving them, a benefit and letting them manipulate the system. Another fact, although it probably seems silly to us who live in New York and have itty-bitty tiny apartments, if you're like me, on the plains, 160 acres wasn't that much land. If you wanted to turn a real profit, you needed more land than that to grow grain on. So if people were moving out there and if they even could start up a farm, it was hard to actually make money off the farm. So the Homestead Act seems like a great offer. Did it pan out? Meh. Railroads, the government was not alone in wanting to promote farming. Railroads also decided to play a role. Because if there was more farming in the West, more people would want to take what was farmed in the West and ship it out east using railroads, right? Which means that they would have more business. So remember, we looked at in the first section of this chapter the fact that the government gave subsidies of land to railroads. Well, the railroads decided to take some of that land that they got from the government and give it to farmers. The railroads recruited both Easterners and immigrants to help settle land on the plains. They were actively trying to get people out there just to kind of get more business for themselves. Sodbusters. So the soil of the plains was covered with a thick layer of sod, or a tangle of grass and soil. If you have family in the suburbs, probably you are familiar with this in some way. I know my parents have brought this up. It's basically like those chunks of grass and dirt that you could put down instead of seeding your lawn, what have you. But plains farmers became known as sodbusters because they had to break up this thick layer of sod in order to actually use the land for farming. What would they do? They would cut sod into bricks to build walls. They were trying not to just get rid of this resource. They would use specific drills, which would bury seeds deep underground to plant crops. They would use reapers to harvest crops, threshers to beat the hard coverings off of grain, windmills to pump water out from underground. They put up fences, including barbed wire, to protect their crop from cattle. Do you need to know all of these specific tools for the exam? Not necessarily, but I would know that the layer of sod on the plains made farming there a little bit more difficult. And there had to be adaptations made like these to work with that land. Okay, so looking at the way families worked on the farms in the West, men worked on the farm all day. Sun up to sundown, you do what you got to do. Children did not get a free pass. They would have to tend animals and help with chores around the house. Women had a lot of responsibilities. They had to make sure the house was well kept. They would plant and even harvest crops. They had to educate the children, nurse the sick, sew clothing, preserve food, make household necessities. Remember, we keep coming back to this idea that the West, a lot of these towns in the West, were boom towns that sprung up rapidly. So you really needed to be self-sufficient. You couldn't rely on stores being accessible to you or the government having set up certain systems. In a lot of cases, you were there doing the work before those systems had been put into place. Exodusters. I think this is such an interesting name and such an interesting topic. So African Americans who headed west to help settle the plains were called exodusters. This name was based on, first of all, the book of Exodus, a book of the Old Testament and the Torah that tells the story of the Jews fleeing slavery in Egypt. So, of course, there was no slavery in the United States anymore. We're talking, post-Civil War. But we have African Americans who want to escape the culture of slavery, maybe, that was still active, and the prejudices that were still active on the East Coast, moving west, hoping for more opportunities. And the dust part came from the dust that was prominent in the Plains region. Many exodusters settled in the West, becoming farmers or working for townspeople. Last rush for land. So a lot of this land is being given away. A lot of the land in the West is being given away or sold. And there's little land left elsewhere in the country. So the government decides to open the Oklahoma Territory to homesteaders. There were people called boomers who basically gathered in a line near Oklahoma City, waiting to claim territory as soon as it was available. You stand on this line, you fill out your paperwork, you do what you have to, you were handed a deed for this land. There were also people nicknamed Sooners who snuck onto the land before it was technically available and claimed territory for themselves. In 1890, it was declared that the government no longer had territory left to give out for homesteading, and this meant the frontier was closed. America was settled. We had people living on all of our territories and trying to build the populations up there. But your notes are not closed. So we come to the grain crisis. And this idea of supply and demand is going to be pretty essential to us over the next few chapters. We'll keep coming back to it. So according to the principle of supply and demand, it's an economic principle. We'll talk about it in class. If you have a little bit of a product that a lot of people want, you can charge high prices for it. So think about Hamilton tickets, right? There are only so many tickets available, and everybody wants one. And if you go on StubHub, guess what? They're selling for $1,000 each. Because people are willing to pay that when the supply is so low, but the demand is so high. Look at the flip side. If you have a lot of a product that few people want, you can charge low prices for it. So if we think about, if Apple still had a bunch of, iPhone 4s sitting around and the 7 has just come out, probably fewer people want the 4, so they drop the price for it. You'll notice that the older model phones, the price always drops when the newer comes out. That's related to supply and demand. So although grain production increased in the West, right, we have a lot more farmers out West producing grain. The supply is bigger. The demand didn't increase, right? We still have the same amount of people in our country that want to consume grain. So that meant that the more grain was produced, they were producing more than could feasibly sell, so farmers had to drop the price if they were hoping to sell any at all. If the price drops, that meant that farmers couldn't make a profit, and therefore they couldn't afford to pay off the loans that they had taken out to set up their farms in the first place, and in effect, many farmers lost their land. Not a good thing. So farmers need to find ways to work together to help each other and prevent things like the grain crisis from happening again. So because farms were separated by large distances, farmers were often out of communication with each other, right? It was hard for them to work together. So granges were groups of farmers, and we could almost even think about it as farmers' unions, formed to stay in touch and meet for lectures and other events, educate themselves about their industry. In 1867, small local granges, a bunch of them joined together to form the National Grange, a national association of farmers. And what did grangers do? Grangers are people who participate in the granges. They demanded low rates from railroads and warehouses. They elected state officials who would help their cause. And in the 1870s, we have the Farmers Alliance being set up. And what they wanted to do was help farmers set up cooperatives or groups that could pool their money to buy tools, seeds, and supplies at a discounted price. So think about if you go shopping at, the grocery store, and four chicken breasts are like, I don't know, $15. New York City is insane. And if you go to BJ's, you can get like 27 chicken breasts for $15. Well, go to BJ's and then divide it among the people. Everyone has to spend less. My examples are not killing it today, guys. That's okay. Moving on to the Populist Party. Let's get out of that one. So the Populist Party was a political group formed in 1892 by unhappy farmers and members of labor unions, and we're going to get into that more in the next chapter. They really pushed for social reforms. They wanted to see positive changes, and what they demanded was public ownership of railroads and warehouses. They thought if these things were privately owned, it would create problems. They wanted them to be government-owned and therefore government-regulated. They demanded an income tax instead of a property tax, where you're taxed on the money you make and not what you own, right? Because many farmers owned all this land, owned all this equipment, but were not making money themselves, so how could they possibly pay high taxes on those things? And they also wanted an 8-hour workday. They wanted to use silver in addition to gold in order to form the national currency. We'll talk a little bit more about the gold standard in class. And the Populist Party hoped for inflation, or a general rise in prices, because they thought that this would help farmers pay their debts. That's not quite the way it works. We will talk about that again soon in an upcoming economic lesson. Moving to the election of 1896, this is the final slide for today. Democrats and populists supported William Jennings Bryan, who was called the Great Commoner, because he wanted to use silver as part of our national currency. So to overview it, all of the money, every dollar in your wallet, is based on a certain amount of gold in the national bank. And it's called the gold standard because most countries use just gold. Bryan wants to use silver, and true, we have a lot of silver in our country, and adding that would make it seem like we have more money in circulation. Republicans, bankers, and business owners at this time supported William McKinley because he wanted to continue using only gold. He thought if we used silver, it would kind of cheapen the value of the American dollar. McKinley ends up winning. Populists wind up fading to the background, and our chapter comes to a close. That is it for Chapter 17. Test coming up soon. Have a good afternoon, guys.